Several folks have signed up to demonstrate things they've been working on recently. And first up, we've got Amos, who's got cast iron earrings to demonstrate. Amos, what you got to show us, brother?
All right. So this was a Mother's Day project in that my mom discovered that she very much enjoys collecting cast iron and fixing it up and reseasoning it and repairing it, getting rid of all the rust, and that was something that she liked to do. And I thought it would be cool to make some cast iron earrings for Mother's Day. Now, of course, you wouldn't typically want to put actual metal of any significant mass hanging from your ears, but if you have something that looks like metal, i.e. plastic, then that would be perfectly fine. And so if you go to the first slide, this was a little pan that we've had for a long time, and I decided I'm going to scan this and shrink it down to earring scale. And there's several different approaches for scanning things. If you have things for slightly larger scale, one of those ways is to use a Connect. So if you go to the next slide, you can see that a Connect has, an IR, or at least the Connect, the first Connect for Xbox 360 had an IR dot projector and a camera to see those dots, and it's basically structured light is how it works. So it looks at the relationship between the dots that it's projected out based on what it thinks it would theoretically see, and creates a full depth map from that. It's not particularly high resolution, but more or less the same technology has been shrunk down now, and the Face ID sensors on iPhones. I think iPhone X was the first one to do that. But anyway, if you have a iPhone 10 or newer, you have essentially a Connect in the top, in the notch. And so if you go to the next slide, you can see in the top left, that's what you actually see in the infrared from a Connect sensor. And it's kind of coarse, like essentially if you got rid of all the rest of the light you saw in that image and you only could see the dots and you're trying to figure out what's going on, it's going to have a tough time with something like a hand or the size pan that I was working with. And it also isn't going to do well with very, very shiny objects. And then below is what you get from the Face ID sensor. So they're similar, but you can see that it's a little bit higher resolution on the Face ID sensor. And also the newest, like the 12 Pro, has another one on the back side, but it's lower resolution like the Connect. So for doing small things, it's really better to use the Face ID one. And so I recently, as in last fall, got an iPhone with a Face ID sensor, and I found this app on the next slide called M3D, which is for iPhones, and it's one of the less frustrating ways of just getting a mesh. It's not free. I mean, you can scan things, but if you want actual like usable exports of it, there is a fee to it. I don't think it was very much, but anyway, and it's made by some makery person, so perfectly fine to pay that. And they also have a model on Thingiverse on the next slide that allows you to reflect that higher resolution sensor forward facing, so you can see the preview of what you're getting live. And that's really the advantage over using just taking a bunch of photos and sending it through a photogrammetry pipeline, is that photogrammetry in most cases will give you a higher resolution model and a textured model if you can do color printing. But the structured light approach gives you a model immediately, and it's dimensioned. You don't have to put something of scale in there and then dimension it after the fact, which is kind of nice. And so I printed off, on the next slide, I printed off that reflector, got a little mirror. I added some fillets to it just because I wanted to, make it look a little bit slicker. And then that slid over the phone. And I decided I was going to take 2 passes at it, one for the back and one from the inside, and then combine the scans later, which is something that you may not know how to do, which is why I thought I would go over it here. So on the next slide, you can see what I got straight from the app. Just took 15 seconds to make each of the scans, not very long at all. And so the challenge is then to align those meshes properly and then combine it into a single watertight mesh. So the approach is you want to take the planar region and make sure that they're both basically on the same plane. And I used a plugin for Blender called World Align that lets you paint a region of the mesh and be like, this is a plane, and it will take the average of the normals of all the faces that you've painted, and then you can say, align this to the world coordinates. And it will do that, and then you can do that for both models, and then now the planes are like with no rotation, fiddling, not eyeballing, they will be aligned at that point, and then you just translate an X and Y until they line up. That works for this model because it's simpler. If you have something that's more organic, there's another plugin called Iterative Closest Point Registration, where it does a weighted squares thing and kind of jiggles the part into the space that will cause it to fit the best. And if you go to the next slide, there may be an animation. I don't think it's going to work, but anyway, if you look it up on the Blender Marketplace, there's Iterative Closest Point Registration, and they show a really cool demo of like the two bunny models. One of them's completely different poly, and they just line up perfectly automatically. So very useful if you have several different scans that you need to patch together, and some of them have holes in different places. So then I go to a different open source piece of software called MeshLab on the next slide. So on the handle, you can see in the top right, there's a little ribbon that I just added in Blender to kind of guess at reconstructing the top part of the handle. And I just exported the points only. I don't even care, because for the algorithm that I was going to run, it will give you watertight points. It doesn't matter if there's holes in the mesh. It just needs the points, and it does fancy math, and it will give you just a solid model. So below is directly what I got out of that algorithm. I didn't even really need to change the default values much at all, and it just gives you a watertight mesh that you can print pretty much immediately. But you can go back into Blender, because manipulating things in Meshroom is miserable. There isn't even an undo 10 years later. So you save often, and if you ever make any mistakes, you have to reopen a save file to undo. It's a pain, but it's also free, so who can complain, So on the next slide, I took it back into Blender and just used some of the smoothing and sculpting tools to just kind of smooth out those points and make it cleaned up. Now, for 3D printing with modern slicers, because we are not in the age of Skyforge, where it takes hours to slice, it is perfectly fine to take a high resolution model and just slice it directly. It'll be fine once it's G-code. But I wanted to take it and simplify it, just because that's what you would do. Particularly, like, suppose you were doing a figurine and you wanted to make it animatable. The technique to use then is a retopology tool, and I'm using a tool called RetopOflow, but there's some one button click options that will do a decent job for some things. I did something that's a little bit more manual, and on the next slide you can see the result after I symmetrized it. So I ended up with something much lower poly, and basically all the polygons kind of align with the flow of the geometry, which would be important if I were animating it. But in principle, in this case, the result is basically exactly the same as the previous step. It was just more because I wanted to do it.
That I will tell you.
And then if you go to the next slide, I have the first print. So I switched to a 0.25 millimeter nozzle, so I could print smaller and have higher resolution. I could go down to 0.15, but it was not necessary for this. And then I said, you know what, this is not quite complete. Like, it's the right scale, that I was looking for, but it needs a little more. So I went back into Blender, added a sphere, scaled it down on Z, and just kind of sculpted it in a little bit, added another sphere, scaled it down, did a union between the two, and then kind of blurred the boundary, and then printed that out with a color change in between. And if you go to the next slide, you can see the result. So I mean, it took literally 5 minutes of modeling and slicing, and 5 minutes later I had it from the printer. It was very nice to be able to do that. No painting, just it's in the filament. So then the only other thing I had to do was just get some commercial little fixtures and a little box for it, and then that's the next slide. That is the result there. And so the models are on Printer. So if you happen to very much like cast iron or know somebody who likes cast iron, you can definitely download themselves and print them out. And yes, she did like them. But yeah, and if you happen to be on the have an iPhone or a phone with a structured light scanner, that is an approach you can use to combine together multiple scans and get a usable model.
Great call on adding the eggs. It gives it so much more character. That's really fun.
Yeah, I realized after the fact that I was basically making like the Lodge logo in earring form, but oh well. Maybe they've got a good logo.
No, thanks for sharing that, man. That's a really, really nice looking outcome. It's very charming.
Thank you.
All right. Next up this evening, we've got Tim, who's going to show off a mystery circuit build. Tim, tell us what's up.
Ray very generously asked several people if they would be interested in building a completely unknown circuit board, and I was one of the people who did, and the only thing that he asked was that we show it off after we're done. So over the course of about 3 weeks, which unfortunately I missed the first two and only was able to show up at the end, we put this thing together, and it basically was just a whole bunch of small stuff that you solder together with a bunch of LEDs and a speaker, and I believe it is supposed to be a synthesizer. So if you can advance to the first. I really like using Handy Tack, which is the little blue dot there, to hold down the various components while you're doing this. That way you don't have to use your fingers or your hands or anything else. You can jam it as hard as you want down into the board, put tack around both sides of it, and it'll just hold anything in place. And you can go to the other side and do whatever you need to do. Really useful for the LEDs, and especially and the little 3-pin headers. It held those in place perfectly. You can go to the next slide, please.
Before I do, what is that sassy red soldering iron you've got there?
Oh, that is the pencil.
You got a red one. Okay.
Yeah, I sprung for the extra $5 to get the red case for it whenever I ordered mine.
Okay.
So I was happy with that. And I also ordered the really small set for it. So I've got one that's barely bigger than the, actually it's not bigger, it's smaller than the traces on these circuits that you can see on it. So, and that takes like so long to heat up the big stuff, but it works really good on the small ones. So, you know, you're going to be having a sandwich while you wait on the other ones to heat up a little bit. And the next photo is just the back side of it. So if you want to quickly go to that one, then everybody can see the back side of it, and then they can skip back over to the front. I mounted the speaker on the back, just shortened the wires really, really short so that they only went exactly where they needed to go. And you can see there on the left side, right above that potentiometer where you got the resistor, I skipped ahead of everybody else and I went ahead and soldered that thing in place. And then Ray's like, oh yeah, and you need to solder in this resistor before you put the pin in. And I was like, oh, oops. So I just snipped that and ran it around the back side of the board to make the connection so that, you know, still makes its thing actually works. But this is what it does when you got it turned on. It makes a pretty little light show and starts to, well, this one's not dancing for whatever reason right now, but it was dancing a minute ago. But it will make all sorts of fun little noises and everything like that. I was fooling around with it because I got a new toy a minute ago, and I probably shouldn't have been fooling around with it. this should have shown up before I actually started working on it, but it's a nice little microscope that has a digital or has a little LCD screen on it. And I probably messed it up because I was messing with it. But I'll resolder in the connections and make sure everything is good. It was working just fine before. But thank you very much, Ray, for generously donating these things. I think everybody that did it enjoyed it quite a bit.
All right. Yeah, it was a really fun session. And the outcome to me is a really impressive circuit.
Mm-hmm.
Ray says he wants to hear what noise you got that thing to make.
Can you hear it? I was going for a old Star Trek episode where I don't know if you remember it or not, but there was this thing that Kirk had to stare at, and it like brainwashed him, but it made a noise just like that. And whenever I fiddled around with it, and I was like, oh man, it actually can do that. So, you know, I had that, and I've got a red alert that it can do, but I've got to do a lot of adjusting on the pins in order to get it to do that. But yeah, the original series.
So Ray wants to know how you did that. Are you twiddling the knobs live, or have you got it actually doing that based on jumper positions alone?
No, I'm twiddling the knobs live.
I thought so. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because that's half the fun in it is, you know, playing with the different knobs and seeing what all you can get it to do.
Yeah. It's a very clever circuit. Well, thanks for sharing that with us.
And then changing the jumpers and seeing what it does the next time that you fiddle with all the knobs. There's so many combinations.
Right. All right. Well, thank you very much, brother.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Next up, we've got our friend Martin, who's going to share Nerodesic frost protection technology with us.
Is my audio okay?
Yes, sir. Sounds good.
Good. Can we have the first slide?
Certainly.
It's spring. Happy plants and happy plant people until there's a forecast for the late frost. And the research is not all in yet of whether plants actually break out in a cold sweat at such a forecast, but their humans certainly do. So the problem we're going to try to solve here is how to avoid injuring our plants with a late frost. Next, please. Motivations for different for everybody. This is an old-time apple variety that was our favorite when we lived in a cove in the North Carolina mountains, and we grafted this to semi-dwarf rootstock, and you can see the blooms it had on it this spring. So we were especially eager to protect this. And next. And then there's the hydrangeas. This is not a spring flowering hydrangea, but among the several bushes, shrubs, there's a couple of them that peak of the season, maybe 6 or 7 feet in diameter. A lot smaller now with in the spring they were when they were pruned for the winter, but still is a challenge to get those protected. And for the next slide, you can see this is a photo quilt that Barbara designed from that preceding picture and another picture by slicing and dicing. So we really wanted to keep that inspiration as well as the enjoyment of the individual plants. So what are you going to do? You want to enclose a large volume with the least material that you can that will have some insulating value and be lightweight and easy to handle and cheap and easy to put together. Next, maybe you want a geodesic dome, or maybe you don't, because as fabulous as Buckminster Fuller's geodesic domes were and are. If you're just wanting to encompass a volume with linear struts, then they're real efficient. But if you actually want to enclose it by making planar triangles, then there's an awful lot of waste, sometimes more waste than you're using of material that comes in sheets or on a roll. So that's vexed folks for a lot of folks for a long time. Vinay Gupta dealt with that problem and said, we got all this 4x8 plywood and other building material. Isn't there some way we can use that without any waste? So a little diagram, middle of the left column, it was the insight that he had that something that's a 2x1 proportion, if you cut it diagonally and do some flipping around, you can come up with a triangle that is as tall as it is wide. There may be some name for that. I don't know, but that means that whereas if you put 6 equilateral triangles together, you get a planar hexagon. If you put these that are as tall as they are wide together, they're going to poke out of the plane, like the circled at the bottom at the left column, little shallow pyramid. And then Gupta went ahead and attached some 4x8 sheets at the bottom and came up with what he called a hexayurt. And there are now thousands of those in years when we can actually have a Burning Man. But then he was in turn vexed by how can I expand this idea. So he finally asked Edmund Harris, and Harris in short order came up with a couple of solutions. The one at the top, the tridome, then another variation at the bottom, but the one at the top appealed to me. I'm going to, there's some links. But still, once I got past that pyramid, that was a little more than I wanted to deal with. And I wanted to work with foam core board to throw something together fast. And you can get it in 4x8 sheets, but I didn't have that. But I did have 30-inch by 20-inch sheets. That's 3x2. So let's look at the next slide. How do you solve that problem? Well, there may be some other way to do it, but I just made a 2-to-1 rectangle by cutting 5 inches off of it and set those aside, the little ones outlined in red at the top. And my numbers are wrong here, so let me see if I can paste the correct numbers in here while we're talking. Okay. To just get one of those little pyramids and accept that you have some waste, that's really 6 30x20 sheets, $6 at Dollar Tree, and 6 with scraps from somewhere else. You can make a pyramid and use those to make a little skirt, and if you would get a very short hexayurt out of it, only 5 inches tall. But if you expand a little by cutting up little scraps of foam core, put little triangles in there and get it flare out a little bit and get it up to about 60 inches wide. That 52-inch pyramid would work for several things we needed to cover if I could come up with some walls. And we did have a way to have some cylindrical solutions that you'll see for some of them. But what I needed to go for that apple tree, I needed a 7-foot dome. So for that, we'll see what I came up with that, and that took 14 sheets. The triangles at the top, there was the waste, then the 20 by 30-inch sheets, and then the ones with waste with little triangles in in the kind of magenta color there. I've seen that some folks have a little bit of trouble visualizing flipping around that triangle. So that's what I'm showing at the bottom. It's just 3 transformations. You got a rotation, 180 degrees, got a mirroring, and then a translation to align your second triangle with the first one. In this case, you get a 30-inch by 30-inch triangle. Next. Now it's really start cutting, start slicing. Sliced off that 5 inches of waste. And then this is a 40-inch Logan Simplex mat cutter that's 35 or 40 years old. I think they make them still exactly the same way. Next. And then we start taping them together. You see the one, you can see a little shine up the middle of the triangle on the floor, just using clear packaging tape and using a squeegee or a decal applicator to get good contact there. And I was just doing it on one side, maybe I did it on both sides, and starting to put the pyramid together. Next. And there we have the pyramid. So that's about 52 inches on the flats, which would help cover a lot of shrubs that we have. I had only so much foam core and had to get it done that night. So the next slide, you can see discovered that you can actually flat pack this. You can fold it. If it were thicker material or couldn't mush quite as easily as the foam core, it wouldn't be possible. So I have not seen anybody talk about being able to do this, but they were generally using thicker material, thick insulating foam boards, like 1/2 inch or more thick. So next, I had to keep moving to larger spaces. Next. Here, that came in handy to be able to fold that flat and work just half of the pyramid at a time. So here I'm attaching the 20 by 30 inch, and you can see that there's some triangles there. Again, if we put equilateral triangles in there, we would just have a planar shape, which could work for some circumstances. But I wanted the full dome because I didn't know whether it's going to rain during the course of this, and I didn't need the greater span by just making this flat. So I worked out that 15 inch by 18.5 inch, which did make some waste, but it only took 2 more sheets to do that. Next. Had to move outside for this to tape that together. And you can see this is the Dollar Tree foam core that has those ripples through it. If you want something flat, you need to pay more than $1 for it. But this worked for me. So next, we'll see it in place atop the tree. The first night, the best we could do was I had some 6-inch tall welded wire fencing with 2 by 4 inch openings, 14 gauge. Had a couple of 12.5 inch lengths of that. There were even cuts out of the 50 or 100 foot rolls of it. And overlapped those, zip tied them together, and then we just clothespin scrap fabric to it. And we flopped some more welded wire fencing over the top that night, zip tied that, and some more fabric over that. But it was, the tree got bit, but there were more nights to come. So next. To get ready for the next one, I was not going to have time to make more domes, but I needed to do better for the cylindrical part of the solution. So this is 3-foot welded wire fencing, 14 gauge with 2 by 4 inch openings, and we have some Tyvek house wrap. And this tape in my handy 50-year-old dispenser here is This is the Lowe's house wrap tape, which is pretty sticky stuff. And you've seen some folks that started wrapping a house and then construction was halted and many months pass and, holds up pretty well. So I thought this would work for a night or two or three. Next. And you can see I started wrapping on one end and went around and left some overlap for myself so that I could just zip tie the wire together just by poking some holes, and then could tape that loose flap as protection against wind. Next. So here we have that hydrangea in one of them, and it's light state. This is the 12.5 foot length makes a cylinder that is very close to 4 feet in diameter, which we did a little more pruning and a little joggling and got it to fit in there. In the foreground and some in the back, you can see some white fiberglass stakes that we pounded in and to keep the wind from blowing this away. Next. And for this, I reused one of my compost bin covers that I showed and shared in 2019. This is black chloroplast, 4 by 4 feet, cut to an octagon, and folded it, scored and folded it. This is hot glue, which I found out does not work. It might work on fresh chloroplast, but not after it's been outside for years and got a coat of dust and whatnot. So this is still a work in progress to figure out how to do that. And you see the other solutions here of just the kitty litter buckets and various white 2 gallon, 3.5 and 5 gallon buckets, bricks on them or little stakes around them to keep the wind from blowing those away. Next. And so for that night, we were able to reuse the dome itself, the near geodesic dome, by just pounding stakes in, and we were in a hurry and didn't even bother with all to poke the holes, so we kind of boogered up the foam core by just pounding the stakes in, but that spanned a good bit of some of the hostas that we were a little more eager to protect. You can see this Solomon's plume in the foreground, the native plant formerly known as false Solomon seal, but come on now, this is 2021. It's its own plant, so we call it Solomon's plume now. So that was a successful venture for us to, we protected some things better than we might have and better than we have in some past years.
Very cool. I really enjoyed the first completed image where the you had the sort of the rigid dome at the top and then the sides kind of look soft. To me, that really invoked like a NASA probe having landed in your yard.
Right.
All right. Well, that's excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Martin.
Yeah.
Next up, we have Sean, who has a spiritual table to share.
Hello. Yes, my spiritual table is actually a tray, and it's, if you go to the first slide, a while back I had received this puzzle that's like an MC Escher tessellation, and it was geese and fish, and seeing as how there is just a single repeating pattern of the entire thing, it took 3 days to put together a 250-piece puzzle. But yeah, so this was quite the challenge, and I really liked it because it was just really cool to look at. So I decided to save it and preserve it somehow. So I decided I wanted to cast it in some resin and use it as sort of a bar tray. And so what I did was I coated it in Mod Podge and sealed it so that it wouldn't fall apart. And my intention was to have it so that it would seal up the puzzle so that when the epoxy was on it, it wouldn't soak in. When you're doing that, I would advise you seal the back because I did not, and therefore it did. So that's one of the many missteps on this project, as you'll see. So if you go to the next slide, I found that tray online. It just fit the dimensions nice, and I was going to build one, but I figured it's just as easy to find a nice one that already had the right dimensions. So if you go to the next slide.
Is that just one layer of Mod Podge?
I brushed several layers, but only on the top. I didn't think it through.
Okay.
So I decided I wanted to experiment a little bit with the colorings. I had received some pigments and some dyes for resin, and this was like a red mica powder. And I was like, oh, let's see how it looks when so I decided to dust a little bit on the edges there. And if you look, it's just like it looks cool. But then when you put the resin down, it doesn't really show up so well. And as I saw it, you can kind of see the red through it, but it really didn't show up in photos at all after the resin was on top of it. You just need a lot more of this mica pigment to really show up. So if you go to the next slide, as you can kind of see, the red underneath didn't really show up. So after I had cast the clear epoxy, you can kind of see on the edges of some of those puzzle pieces how there's that dark outline, and that is from the resin soaking in and ruining it a little bit. So that's the lesson. If you're going to put a puzzle in anything with any sort of liquid in it, seal the entire thing. So because the red wasn't showing up, I decided to use some of this quick cast epoxy that we had at the space, and I mixed it up, and I was like, oh, I'm going to do this sort of like splatter squiggle thing on the edge there. But what I didn't know was that even though it starts clear, it dries a solid white. So the very deep red that I had originally poured turned into this Pepto-Bismol pink. And so that did not turn out as well as I hoped. And then the thin squiggles there, as you can see. And then the next photo, they also spread out because they were different viscosities of resin. And so the thin little squiggles of deep red and deep black all of a sudden spread out into wide, splotchy disasters of Pepto-Bismol and asphalt gray. So if you go to the next slide, that is also that is what happens. This resin was real. It was really viscous to begin with, and then it's a very quick curing. So it goes from a liquid to a solid in an instant, pretty much. And I always had some, and I decided to pour some off into some molds that I had. And in the process of pouring it into the mold, it solidified, and that was what was inside the cup. So the bottom of the mold there, and then it just sort of slumped over into this wrinkle, and the whole thing turned solid. So like I said, it turns bright white as well. So if you go to the next, that is sort of what it ended up looking like. That gray and pink around the edge, but it was done. Done was done. It was one of my first resin pouring projects anyways. So I just decided, hey, I'll put the extra clear layer on top, sealed it all off. It turned out all right as far as the actual sealing. None of it leaked out the edges of the tray. I thought maybe I'd have to put some hot glue or something to seal the joints in between the tray, but no, that was fine. And then if you go to the last photo, you'll see why I don't really care that it doesn't look so great now, because it is covered up almost completely by everything that I put on top of it. So if I want to look at the puzzle, I'll just move everything out of the center. But otherwise, that was a few missteps in early resin. I've since learned my lesson. So let this be a lesson in resin. Cast forever. It looks amazing with all the stuff on it.
Well, you wound up with something functional and learned some stuff about resin pour along the way. So that seems like a success.
Yeah, because the clear resin has about a 45-minute working time, and it takes about an hour or a day to fully cure.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one, with the colors in it, was, like I said, 3-minute cure, and it gets very hot, and you can feel the heat through the mixing cup, and then that pretty much turns to a solid almost immediately after that. So that was another lesson to learn, is if you definitely know your working times.
So out of curiosity, most of my experience with using resins is in doing like fiberglass stuff. And with that, you can put in different amounts of hardener to determine how hot you want the mixture, which effectively dictates, your working time. Is there an equivalent for this type of resin, or does it not work that way?
It has to pretty much just be a 1-to-1 mixture of the two. I mean, it's the clear resin, I have, it's a little more forgiving, the clear resin. I've done my best to eyeball. They give you measurements for, I forget what the proportion is for if you measure by weight, but by volume, it's 1-to-1. And it's also 1-to-1. I think it's 10-to-9 for the white fast cure. It's 9-to-1 weight or 1-to-1 volume. And that, if you get that even a little wrong, it kind of turns into this greasy mess. Like if you do it right, which I have done for a couple other things I've cast, it turns into a nice hard plastic. But if you don't get it right, it kind of stays soft, and it's a little greasy, and it's just it comes out very sloppy. So that one, you definitely do need to be more on the money with your volumes on that.
Wow, that does sound kind of unforgiving.
Yeah, and I mean, and especially when you're working very quickly, it's hard to sometimes see. So maybe next time I might measure it out by weight and then combine the two. And I also learned that if you're going to do colors, sometimes it helps to add the color to 1 cup first and then mix that well before you mix everything together, because mixing the two and then adding color and making sure the color is distributed is just cutting into your working time.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing your project, brother.
Thank you very much.
Next up, we've got Sue, who's going to share a display case of some sort. Sue, what have you got for us this week?
Well, this week is nothing sewing. I thought I would go back and I found a project that I did a long time ago, just over 20 years ago, in fact. And it would be very difficult to bring it in to the space. I think, Sean, everyone would enjoy you bringing your project into space, especially with the covering. However, this one is a little trickier. About 20 years ago, Disney celebrated 100 years of magic, and McDonald's went in with them and had Happy Meal toys. Well, I love Disney, and I ate a lot of Happy Meal toys, or Happy Meals, to get every toy in this series. So then I needed a display case. So I only have one slide, which is why you're getting a lot of talk now before the picture. So if you could go to the slide. Now it's a display case. So I had 1x4. I used a table saw to cut the slots for the shelving on the sides and the slots for the plexiglass, as well as the wooden backing. After I got the wooden backing cut, then, gosh, I sure wish I would have had access to a vinyl cutter to make a template for that castle. But I didn't back then, so it was masking painter's tape, cutting it very carefully, and then painting the blue. You'll also see down towards the bottom, you see the red in the bottom half, the red and black. And so that is actually the foamy. And gee, if only I'd had a silhouette cutter like there is in Fabric Arts to cut out those, but no, I had scissors. So that was a lot of work there. Also, it would have been helpful for each of those characters. The statue was not solid on the bottom, and I didn't want the effect of being able to see that there was a hole. So I cut out all those felt circles by hand too. And then you'll see where I took glue, because what is Disney Castle without Tinkerbell? And I did the glue and glitter and just kind of spiraled it on up to Tinkerbell that's sitting on the upper left corner there. And that's my tribute to, I guess you would say, to electronics. It's kind of a nightlight that you can turn on. So yeah, it could have been so much easier having access to the tools we have in the shop today. But yeah, you do what you got to do when you don't have the shop.
Well, for working with arguably suboptimal tools for the purpose, I mean, that came out really professional looking. I mean, it's really fun.
Thank you. And I do have to plug, you know, the laser cutter as well. Would have been nice to have cut that plexiglass instead of trying to run that acrylic on a saw, table saw. The edges are a little jagged. Of course, you can't see it very well, which is good. But yeah.
So by my estimation, that's 100 Happy Meals. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Were they all the same Happy Meal, or did you switch it up?
I don't care for cheese much, so, and I don't remember them having chicken nuggets 20 plus years ago. So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Of course, you know, it's over a series of weeks because they didn't have the new toy every week. You had to wait till the next release. And I did have a little help. My daughter worked for McDonald's at the time.
Aha.
So she would help make sure that I got the ones that I needed.
Very important.
Yes. Yes.
Well, thanks for sharing that with us. That's really a very successful looking project. Do you still have that hanging in your home?
I do. I do.
Nice.
Yeah, that's the kids' room. So.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Sue.
Thank you.
And finally, this evening, we've got Bob, who's going to share a wooden menagerie with us. Although it looks like John Dale has called it a wooden managerie.
Okay, let's see the first slide.
All right.
Well, one of the things about being a woodworker, or in some cases a carpenter, is if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So the only tools I had were woodworking tools, so everything I did had to be made out of wood. My partner, every time we'd go to a furniture store, she'd look at one of these things and say, you know, I really wish I had one of those. And she seemed to be reluctant to just ask me, could you make one? So this last time I bought the wood and I made it to surprise her. And what I didn't include, that cut at the top right and left there on the angled piece is like 15 degrees. Up. Yeah, it's a long cut. It's kind of tough to do on a table saw. And I should have included the little trick that I used. I took a piece of 1/4-inch plywood and double-sided taped the long 1x4 to it at the proper angle. And then I could use the rip fence and just slide it right through in the table saw. And I also taped both pieces together with double-sided tape. Double-sided tape is just your best friend in the wood shop. So anyway, though that was all. That was just how I did that one, and that was just one project for that 2-week period. So I want to go on to the next slide. Fell in love with a cross section of American chestnut log, but it was quite large and also very uneven. So how to even it out? So I bought a surfacing bit for the router, and I made the jig that you see the router riding on there with adjustable legs. And so it's just a question of repeatedly passing over and move the router, pass over, move the router, and so on all the way through. And of course, the variation in the different heights was like a half an inch over between the highest point and the lowest point, and I could only take that's a 1/4 inch trim router, and so I could only take little bites. But by constantly adjusting it and moving it, I did manage to get the thing perfectly flat, turn it over, and do the same on the other side. I have started putting clear acrylic resin into all of the cracks, and it is just eating that resin up like crazy. And so I do it, a little bit at a time and let it cure a day and keep going. So that'll be another time for show and share. So going to the next slide, and there's the top view of the project. It's roughly 2 foot by 3 foot, and I'm excited about doing it. And if anybody's got any suggestions on how to epoxy the edges, I'd be very interested and grateful. Okay, next slide. Continuing on with my projects for the period of time there, my lathe finally came in. There it is without the extension, but the extension did later come in. So I needed to have a stand. And stuff was just getting scattered around in the shop, so I decided to go ahead and just build some drawers too. So that was just, another part of the project. Okay, so next slide. I needed the, we got the bender finally in the blacksmith shop, and I'm going to build a board for mounting all of the different dies. And some of the dies have a 1 inch hole, some of them have a 3/4 inch hole, some of them have a 1/2 inch hole. And one of the things is those 1 inch holes are 1.000 inches. So a 1 inch dowel is not a comfortable fit to slide things over. I needed 15/16. So I went into Lowe's and I said, do you have any 15/16 inch dowels? And when the guy stopped laughing, no, actually, so I decided I've been thinking about this idea for a long time. What if I could build a stand for the router and use it, slide it along, and make my own dowels. And also the lathe has an indexing feature. So with a cove bit, I could cut coves in other things. Anyway, it seemed like a really cool attachment. And years ago, I don't know if anybody remembers the router crafter by Sears that you could put on the lathe and you turn a handle and it would turn the wood and run the router at the same time. So you could put spirals and things. It was really cool. I bought it, had it for 25 years and never used it once. So I thought, if I make this, I'm going to have to use it. And I think the next slide. Yep. So I put a 3/8 inch, 4 foot long rod underneath there. And if you want to back up one. Yep. There, I used that to drive the whole rig back and forth. And you can't really see the rod. It's down underneath there, trying to figure out how to mount it and not get in the way of the tailstock and everything else. And then I said, oh, I can put it underneath. So the router stand has a piece that drops down and picks up that rod. You have to be careful though, because the lathe has the reversing capability, which is a godsend, because when the router's traveling in one direction, let's see, if it's coming toward me or from left to right towards the tailstock, you have to be going in reverse direction on the lathe so that the wood, as it's turning, is going into the router bit. I kind of forgot about that principle early on, and things didn't didn't cut as well. Then the other thing is that you can't go too fast. And if you go to the next slide and then the next slide, there, I don't know if you can blow it up, that piece on the left, and then slide upward. There, you can see what happened when I got going too fast. The middle piece there is a nice smooth 1-inch dowel. And then the raw material is the piece on the right. So anyway, just a fun thing to do, and a different use for a router and a lathe. And then lastly, so let's go to the next slide. Years ago, and I'm talking like 20, 25 years ago, I saw this really cool sculpture. It was 3 steel discs, and there you see the shapes emulated in cardboard. And when they were brought up so that in this position there, and then let go all at the same time, they start falling. And of course, they won't make a full resolution because they just the momentum of the of being slightly off the center of mass, and the period of each one of those discs is different. So they start falling in sequence, and then they start getting out of sequence, and then they come back in sequence, and they get out of sequence. Anyway, the steel sculpture ran for like 45 minutes, and the lady that that had this was complaining to me because she said it doesn't work right. It only runs a few minutes. Well, I looked at the mechanism and everything, and I said, well, we need to make a couple adjustments here. So I leveled the thing out and positioned them. They don't rotate on a bearing. The axle is actually fixed, and it rotates along that support. So there is no sliding bearing, and it really it was fun. So I've been thinking about this project, and I couldn't afford the steel, and I really didn't have a way to cut it. And now, Rob, that I've got a possibility of a plasma cutter, I just might actually make this out of steel. But anyway, the laser cutter gave me the opportunity to cut these circles, and then I had to put a piece in so that I could get to the center of mass to put the axle in. And it was just really fun. I made a little triangle-shaped piece of wood and set the cardboard on it until it just balanced, one way and the other. And then I drew the lines in for that, and I'd move it 90 degrees and just balanced it again. And then where those 2 lines crossed, that was the center of mass. And it was fun. And let's see, I wish we had a video where I could show the thing actually. Go to the next slide. I think it's just a different view, the end view of it. Yeah, you can't. And they really should have 3 axles, but just for the purpose of this picture, to get all 3 of them in the same picture, I shared the axle between the 2. So anyway, that's just one of my series of projects. I've been very busy, and I've got a lot more to do. So that's all I know for now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, brother. That's a really satisfying combination of utilitarian and artistic works you shared with us. All righty. So to close down the event this evening, I have just a few announcements to share with y'all. First off, I want to make you aware that on the 27th, let's see, that would be Thursday, I believe, at 7 p.m. is a Machining 101 class. Machining 100. That is, of course, in Billy's domain, and I believe we have some tickets available for that yet. If you would like to get checked out and learn some nifty skills from Billy, he is, of course, very knowledgeable about that stuff. And then quick on the heels of that, we've got Milling 101. on the 29th at 1 p.m., also coming to us from the auspices of Billy. And so once again, if you would like to use our wonderful Bridgeport tool, then you will need to take this class first. We also have upcoming the Slicer Obedience Training. This is for 3D printing enthusiasts. The Slicer course is part of the software tool chain, and this is a class that's being taught by Paul, who is certainly one of our most skilled 3D printing gurus. This is, if I'm not mistaken, a virtual class, and that is happening at 6:30 on 6/9, and that is open to the general public. So members and non-members are welcome to attend should they wish to do so. And friends, the 8th is coming up very quickly, and on the 8th, we will resume in-person Tuesday night show and share events. So this will be us, more or less, sardined into the classroom in the happiest possible way after our lovely cookout event. So we're going to be making some burgers and hot dogs and have sodas and chips and all that jazz out in the parking lot beforehand. And then afterwards, we'll do our show and share in person once again. So please join us on June the 8th if you can. This is for members only and also their guests. So members and their family or friends that they would ordinarily bring with them. We will be opening to the general public before terribly much longer, but for now, members only. If you would like to participate in show and share, one way that you can get hooked up with that, member or non-member, is to email sas@knoxmakers.org. We would be delighted to incorporate your content so that we can all learn and gain edification from your projects. So sas@knoxmakers.org. Finally, let me remind you that as a member-supported nonprofit, we are always running with very low overhead, and any donations that come our way are very deeply appreciated. One way that you can do that, if you choose to shop with Amazon, is to sign up with the Amazon Smile program. When you buy stuff through Amazon Smile, you pay the same amount as usual, but we get a tiny amount of money from each of your purchases, which is super nice. In the alternative, or in addition, you can also go to knoxmakers.org/donate and simply give us money directly. We are, of course, a real 501c3, and we'll be happy to help you out with your tax deduction should you wish to give us a gift. Thank you in advance. That concludes our festivities for the evening of an official kind. So as soon as Billy stops the recording, then we will open.